Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD, Culture, and Stigma, a podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. Trigger warning. This episode will describe 19th century medical interventions that would likely amount to physical and sexual assault today. This is the second part of my conversation with Nina Shope, author of Asylum, a brilliant historical novel about Augustine, the most famous patient institutionalized for hysteria in the 19th century. Observers of that episode in medical history talk about the perspicacity and blind spots of Augustine's doctor, Jean-Martin Charcot. In Invention of Hysteria, a book about the photographic imagery that came out of Charcot's hospital, we learn that Charcot could nearly forego traditional questions like, "What is the matter?" or "Where does it hurt?" for he seemed to have always already seen. This power sounds slightly sinister, but in response to people who suggested that he invented or cultivated hysteria, Charcot protested, "It would be truly fantastic if I could create ailments as my whim or fancy dictate. But, truth to tell, in this I am nothing more than a photographer. I inscribe what I see." Susan Sontag would snicker at that defense. In On Photography, Sontag wrote, "To photograph people is to violate them, by seeing them as they never see themselves, by having knowledge of them that they can never have." Or as Roland Barthes wrote in Camera Lucida, "The figures in photographs are anesthetized and fastened down like butterflies." But in the case of Charcot's patients, this anesthetizing and fastening down was literal. Similar to lupus, a disease I live with, hysteria was sometimes called the disease of 1,000 faces, and through photographs, doctors like Charcot wanted to pin down each one, a hallucinatory collection of broken butterflies. In Asylum, Nina narrates one of Charcot's public lectures on hysteria and the value of photography. One day, this tool may give us the foresight to recognize criminality, venality, even madness in a person who is yet to commit her first sin. Until that day, we build a case against the hysteric, one photograph at a time, each frame offering evidence to strengthen our scientific conviction. The hysteric is written on and written about, but Nina imagines a world in which she could write herself. And in her afterword to Asylum, she explains, "I hope to avoid reducing Augustine to a case study. I was not interested in grounding the seemingly inexplicable phenomena of hysteria in biographical reality. I wanted to see what would happen if I amplified that reality, if I entered it." Freud believed that returning patients to wellness involved filling in the gaps and fixing the fragmentation within their narrative life stories. I set out to write a hysterical narrative, to embrace fragmentation, to create wholes. In this sense, Asylum finds company with recent feminist and queer historiographies, such as Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman, and After Sappho by Selby Wynne Short. All of these projects dance wildly among the past's glittering shards, highlighting incongruities and mediations, and refusing the illusion of objective truth. Here, in the second and final part of my interview with Nina, she reflects on the photograph of Augustine that she chose to include in her novel, how she avoided flattening historical figures or reducing Augustine to past trauma, and the mythological roots in both the history of female madness and Charcot's photography. I placed a link to Nina's book in the episode notes. You chose one photo of Augustine to include in the book, and there are many, many photographs of Augustine. Just from looking at Invention of Hysteria, there are quite a few in there. I don't know exactly how many exist today, but why did you choose this particular one?
Well, so I
kind
figured
of
first
open to it.
I'll describe it a little bit
Yeah,
since this is an
please.
auditory thing.
Yeah.
So it's a picture of Augustine sitting in a bed, and it's showing her kind of mostly from the waist up, and she's got her hair down, and she's
Mhm.
kind of wrapped in blankets or sheets, but it doesn't look like she has anything on underneath it. And one of her shoulders is exposed, and it's sort of twisted in a strange position that's
Yeah.
kind of twerking her body. So she's like looking over her arm, and
Yeah.
then she's got this kind of very intense look that's she's partially looking upwards, partially at the audience, partially
Yeah.
inside her own, it seems like her own mind. It's a really sexualized, kind of seductive picture of her.
Yeah.
But at the same
Very.
time, like what really that got me drawn in was her gaze in that picture. There's something like the way that she's looking at it's almost sort of infernal and possessed, but at the same time, it's challenging and it's
Yeah.
challenging the viewer, and and then it's also got this sort of inward focus, and it's just always fascinated me. And my sister was going to try to do like the cover for the book, did a very, very, very intense close up of that
Oh,
picture,
wow.
drawing of it. And so there's just something about that gaze that always fascinated me. And also, I think it's just an interesting picture because it looks again like it's a seductive,
Right.
pose, but what it is actually showing the contortion of her arms, supposedly. And it's got a very, unlike some of his photographs, it's got a very clinical caption. That's just something like hysterical epileptic contracture.
Contracture.
Um,
Yeah. And
yeah,
this is
whereas
from 1878 too. It
yeah,
has that
and
notation.
some of his things he would call them ecstasy and like have
Yeah.
very
Right.
florid
It's
examples, and here it's almost
true.
the opposite.
True. Yeah, it's a very clinical title for what at first glance looks almost like a come hither
Yes.
gaze. And if you could see her legs, it kind of reminds me of some pinup poses where
Hmm.
in the way that she's turned towards the camera with her shoulder and her face. But yeah, I think in Didi Huberman's book, he writes about this photo and talks about how when she realized that it is this contracture rather than inherently this seductive pose, or maybe it's both, but that makes it truly sinister. And sinister is apt because it's sort of the left side of her
Yeah.
body. Is it that they really couldn't move in contracture? There are these different states. There's the
Yeah.
contracture and the cataleptic state. And I'm not sure I'm clear on the difference between the
I know, and
two.
I might actually
Yeah.
mix them up too.
Yeah.
But I think that tetany
Yes.
was the state in which it was immovable. Like really,
Right.
it would feel like you're going to break the bone trying to move the person's arm. And then I think catalepsy was this sort of like plasticity where you could
Mhm.
move the limb, and sometimes the patient would change their facial affect to match the
Right.
gesture. So they would put the hysterics into poses before the camera and then like show how it changed their appearance, and then they would use electricity like on the different nerves and muscles. And I mean, it was a very bizarre sort of period of treatment because a lot of it was just documenting what was
Yeah.
happening, and eventually Charcot got into sort of fringy concepts like magnets, metals, hypnosis, and some of those things are still now are coming back into being looked
Mhm.
at, but at the time it was sort of seen more as like a fairground, like
Right.
Barker, come look at the
Yeah.
crazy woman situation. So there was like that going on. Then there was, these really intense, invasive documents of every bodily orifice temperature that
Yeah.
the hysteric had and
Right.
every like fluid they exuded. And then eventually with the hypnosis, it sort of became this situation in which he was trying to provoke all these symptoms that supposedly he had started out wanting to cure. And so
Right.
it all became about just watching and recreating these attacks, which then weren't even technically authentic. And
Yeah.
that became its own like self-sustaining system. So
Yeah.
it went through many bizarre, bizarre
It
phases.
did. And also taking castings of the
Mm-hmm.
women's bodies out of plaster.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, for the
Yeah.
some of the different body parts, some full body castings, and some of the ones like the wax castings were actually there's a picture that I write about in the book of this old woman who they did a full body wax casting of,
Mhm.
and it looks like wax casts can look incredibly real, and
Yeah.
it's really freaky to think of
Yeah.
these doubles of basically being on display within the museum of the asylum, and
Right.
yeah, it's a very disturbing.
And it's such a visual culture
Mhm.
there. Like you said, Charcot turning to photography to try to get some sort of scientific proof, and this seeing photography as this kind of positivism, which is so weird now that we live in a
Mhm.
culture where photos are constantly filtered, changed, and where we know after decades of theorists like Susan Sontag or Roland Barthes that the photograph is just as subjective as something like a painting or a drawing, and only in if only because of what it includes, what it leaves out, what it frames, all of that. But they had such faith in photography as being aligned somehow with science at that time. But it's also interesting how writing played into the kind of culture of hysteria, if you want to call it. And I was wondering, as a writer, what do you make of the phenomenon we see described in this era, in which you include scenes of in Asylum, of somnambulistic writing? It's always really hard to say.
Yeah, it totally
Where
is.
where apparently in these trance-like states, the hysterics would start writing and they would keep writing. And I was wondering if you could read that excerpt too, just to give people an idea of what it was like.
So yeah, so I'll read it first just so people have an idea of
Yeah.
what we're talking about.
Yeah. And then
The phenomenon of somnambulistic writing is indeed unique, you explain. The sound of my scribbling extending your sentence like a hiss. The patient does not truly author, but transcribes, as though her body has become a vessel for our words. She draws no effectiveness from the act, being a mere conduit, almost like the pen itself, an instrument through which our will is made manifest. We tell Augustine to write, and once she has begun, she is wholly concentrated upon the act to an unimaginable extent. To test her focus, we yell at her, speak into her ear, move our fingers over her face, going so far as to pry down her lower eyelids and reveal the conjunctiva, and it will not distract her nor disrupt her prose. Even an absence of ink will not stop the flow of her words. If the paper on which she is writing is rapidly removed, she takes no notice and continues on the downward stroke of the letter that she was in the midst of tracing, only now on the wood of the table. And then this scene goes on where essentially it's at this point in the book where Augustine's keeping secrets from Charcot finally and is sort of
Mhm.
plotting her escape. And this kind of forced hypnotic state, in it, she reveals all sorts of things about her plans and she's
Right.
confessing all this stuff. And meanwhile, Charcot is just doing ridiculous, silly tricks, basically,
Right.
of like, oh, I could pull the paper away and she still
Right.
writes. And so I tried not to come down with anything onto whether it was real or not real. And
Yeah.
because again, like we're going off of accounts of different people, and there were some things that I think couldn't be just created out of thin air, like the hysterics. There was a time where Augustine could like move from a prone to a sitting position like 40 times within a minute. And there's no way you could
Wow.
consciously do that. So
Right.
there was something going on. But in the
Yeah.
book, I really didn't want to weigh on that. I wanted to sort of leave it vague.
Hmm.
So for me, it was more of a way to show that Charcot would give Augustine these tools and assume she had nothing she could do with them, that she was
Right.
really just like kind of this
Yeah.
instrument of his will. And in the end, it becomes something that she's able to use to her advantage because he underestimates the fact that she can have power over him through his kind of blindness to her agency. And so, this is another example where she's very frustrated to
Yeah.
reveal this stuff, but at the same time, it doesn't end up mattering because he doesn't listen to anything she
Right.
says.
This is such a nice parallel with a line from the first excerpt you read, where it says, though we recognize the patient's language, and this is in Charcot's head or in his lecture, we must nonetheless ignore her words. Yeah, she could tell him at that moment, this is my plan to escape, and he just would disavow it. So
Yeah.
there's a great irony there. What do you think happened to Augustine after she escaped? I mean, I know that you say in the afterword that this is kind of a dream Augustine. It's not exactly the historical figure because
Yeah.
you didn't go into some of the details that we do know about her life. I think she ended up, the real Augustine, in the hospital around age 15. And she had been working in the household of a family, and it sounds like the husband raped her. So I don't think you really go into any of that, but I'm wondering if you do have any sense or hopes for what happened to her.
So yeah, so one of the reasons I decided to kind of leave out a lot of the biographical detail
Mhm.
is that I was much more interested in sort of putting the reader into this kind of claustrophobic, bizarre world that existed
Yeah.
between Charcot and Augustine. And that obviously I purposely left out, whole groups of characters and the actual photographers and things like that to create the
Yeah.
claustrophobia. So it is definitely something stylized. And I didn't want the thing, and I'm sure with BPD you can kind of relate to this very frustrating and annoying trend of like, especially in film, of okay, so when are we going to find out she was sexually abused? Oh, so that makes sense, she's this femme fatale or she's super sexualized or whatever. Like there's
Right.
a level to which people make automatically shut down the world of the character
They
and
do.
flatten it out. And
Yeah.
it's not to say that like the actual in real life the traumas that are causing this aren't valid and aren't deeply responsible for some of the things that happened.
Right.
So it's tricky because I didn't want to suggest that. I didn't want to minimize like that. But at the same time, I really didn't want to have that thing happen where it's like, oh, that's the answer.
Right.
Stop paying attention to what's going on.
I
Uh,
completely agree with you because I think that
yeah.
people are so irreducible, but we've gotten into this sort of flashback mode of storytelling, especially through things like prestige TV, where
Mm-hmm.
you get to know the character in the present, and then, oh, we're going to show you what happened to them years ago.
Yeah.
That explains it. And yes, of course, our childhood traumas or adult traumas impact us, but it's not that easy an answer. So yeah,
Yeah. And
I didn't know that was exactly why, but I understand and respect that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of where she ended up, I sort of stopped myself from imagining that. I
Hmm.
don't know why. I mean, I think part of it was that I felt like that was her gesture to actually reclaim her privacy. And
Makes
so it
sense.
made sense to me to just not go beyond that. But at the same time, I think I also, I had a very hard time imagining anything particularly good happening in that
Yeah.
situation. And so when I read Maud Casey's book, The City of Incurable Women, where she
Hmm.
has a small section on Augustine, and
Yeah.
it's happening when the Surrealists actually adopted Augustine as a mascot for the Surrealist movement
Yes.
and were like walking through the streets with posters of her and things. And
So
so,
strange. Yeah.
yeah, and so Maud Casey imagined, well, she would still be, alive at that point,
Yeah.
theoretically. And so she could have seen this happen. And
Yeah,
that
I
was
love that.
so beyond like what I had even considered, but at the
Hmm.
same time, so funny and perfect because in the end, she like just chucks the Surrealist Manifesto into the fire and goes on
Right.
reading her book.
Yeah, that was a nice reclamation because
Mm-hmm.
I feel the same way. It's hard to imagine a lot of a happy ending, in part because one thing that they did with these women was give them a lot of drugs,
Oh,
and
yes.
a lot of them developed dependence on them.
Yeah.
And Augustine seemed to. But since you brought up Maud Casey's book, which is also excellent, it's a interlinked short story collection or novel called City of Incurable Women that came out. Is that
Yeah, it came
correct?
out like 3 months before my book.
Oh, okay. So, yeah,
Yeah.
right. So, right around the same time. And I don't know if you've seen a book called A Matter of Appearance by Emily Wells,
I
but
actually haven't.
yeah, that it's really interesting. That one also came out in around the same time period. I think it was last year. And it's part memoir about her own experience with a rare autoimmune disease and also
Mm.
with her experience with ballet and just kind of relationship to her body. And she also talks about Augustine a lot and intersperses different photos throughout the book. So, three books that, I mean,
Yeah.
it's been great for me, for someone with an interest in this. Three books in the last 2 years, or year, approximately 2 years, about women treated for hysteria at the Salpêtrière. Why do you think we are so interested in these women in this period? Was that just a fluke? But we have seen other books in the past 10, 15 years, like Medical Muses. And I think there was another one about Charcot. What is it that keeps us fascinated with this period in history?
Well, it's definitely been interesting because, like I said, back when I started this, there was almost nothing. And then it was
Yeah.
so And I was sort of tormented by the fact over the years that I let go of the chance to be the first person to really write a book about this or whatever, or around, the first person. And so it was so ironic that it took like 20 plus years, and then 3 months before Maud's book came out. And at first I had like a total crisis about it, and was,
I
like,
understand.
I missed my chance. Yeah. But then I realized, she and I actually did an author's conversation together that no one's agreed to publish yet. But it was really interesting to talk to her and realize that, having a constellation of works around this topic is actually a really valuable thing. And each book brings something different. But I think, this might be presumptive because this is more based on my experience, but I think that if you have any kind of empathetic imagination, which most writers hopefully do, there's something about knowing that this bizarre sort of phenomenon was occurring, and it wasn't even that long ago, and that it really shows you how dependent you are on what the beliefs of your time are. And thinking about if you were just born in a different period of time, you might have gone through what these women have gone through. And after I wrote the book, actually, my best friend's mother told me that her paternal grandmother had been institutionalized for 12 years under a diagnosis of typical hysteria. And was given electroshock therapy. And she said it was probably for symptoms of basically menopause and diabetes. And so that also brought home, it's only been, now I guess about 70 years, because in the 50s, there was a lot of treatment for hysteria, and it almost always was electrotherapy, hysterectomies. And the diagnosis itself didn't go away until the 1980. And then you're exploring, is it got sort of dispersed into other orders. And there's still so much of that kind of mystical, misogynistic, mythological weirdness that's really still at the root of all that. And there are all these symptoms and beliefs that come from that time that I very much think are still within the diagnoses that are linked to hysteria. Yeah. So I think it's just sort of like half fascination and disbelief, and at the same time it feels very possible.
Hysteria and the things that Asylum chronicles, what does that have to say about the way that we conceptualize mental illness today, or about contemporary power dynamics between doctors and patients?
Yeah, I'd say one of the things that interested me the most was, again, going back to the mythology. And it made me think that nowadays we think of mythology as, linked to literature and religion. And we don't remember that the hard, supposedly hard sciences like medicine and biology, all these things actually started in ancient Greece. Like the Hippocratic Oath was an oath to Apollo. One of the stories in the book, Hippocrates sent his patient, who was clearly pretty much on the hysteric scale of symptoms.
Definitely on the hysteric spectrum.
He sent her to the Oracle at Delphi to get a cure. So there are these ways in which there's a profoundly or irrational, mystical understanding of the womb and the female body, and this intense discomfort about women's ability to create and produce, and this male need to kind of usurp that. And if you look back at the mythology of the Bacchae, which really is the first true mad women depicted, it all starts off with Zeus basically immolating this pregnant lover and then snatching the fetus and sewing it into his own thigh and giving birth to a god that way. So it's I think that we've come so far from the stories, but the assumptions, beliefs, institutions, and even the language and names of these diseases are still coming from back then. And that if we don't start peeling back the layers and looking at that, then we're failing to see that there's this whole structure upon which people have justified violating and controlling other people's bodily autonomy. And it's based on these sorts of mystical, misogynistic, racist, whatever, beliefs. And so I kind of think of history like this layer of tissue where you can either peel them back and show everything that's overlapping and kind of going on at the same time, or you can just keep putting them on top of each other and not realize that by doing so, you're basing your modern beliefs on this whole background of problematic justifications. My interest is pulling that back those levels and saying this is still happening. And just even with the SCOTUS ruling on abortion, where Alito, relied on witch judges, killed witches to justify something about female reproduction again. And it's really eerie how much that's come to the forefront, obviously, in the last couple of years.
I've filmed interviews with a woman named Luciano who is studying bioethics and especially what she calls spectro-reproductive justice. So looking at what happened with the collapse of Roe v. Wade through a ontological perspective, thinking about ghosts, thinking about how, for one thing, the ghosts of future children are privileged over a woman's body. And yeah, and I can see resonances with the history of hysteria too and Roe v. Wade. Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think when I first started thinking about hysteria and its connection to contemporary illnesses, I was really pretty tightly focused on the connection with BPD because certain scholars have explicitly commented on it. I see a lot of other overlaps with a lot of other things as well, like eating disorders, and certainly with the connection to the uterus, diseases like endometriosis, which I also have. And it's shocking how little even gynecologists sometimes know about it. And I feel like knowing what happened in medical history at certain moments, like 19th century France and hysteria, it makes things more explicable, no less alarming, but it
No.
gives us this historical context. And it's great when a novel can bring it to life in a way that feels very immediate and raw. How do other people characterize your novel? And how do you characterize it in terms of calling it a historical novel? I know you write about this in the afterword, but just to give some comments here, do you see Asylum as a historical novel?
I do in a way, but I'd say
Right,
like probably like what I essentially think of it as is a work of experimental fiction that's historically based.
right.
Um, and so I did try to, I'm kind of fascinated by trying to keep as much to the facts as I can in a certain
Mhm.
way, partially because, like, again, it's amazing to me that these aren't just some nightmares out of my own
Yeah.
head, that they're real. And I think it's
Yes.
much more powerful to just say, like, this actually happened than to invent
Yeah.
around it. But the thing that I want to do with writing, I definitely don't see the value for myself in just creating like a period piece as an artifact. And I think, in
Right.
fact, like that creates all these really complicated issues about objectivity and authenticity and all this stuff. And it
Mhm.
just further kind of enacts this whole process by which people erase everything else that's going on
Yeah.
and sort of present like this was this. In all my writing, I try to kind of create a space where the reader is sort of shocked into relationship with the characters in a way that's unusual and they're not used
Right.
to doing. So you're not just watching this happen and being like an observer, that there's something that kind of triggers this commonality of either terror or
Right.
distress or, you know, the fear of embodiment that so many of us have. Because I think like doing that gets us to understand another person's interiority in a
Right.
way that makes it a lot less easy to justify violating it and controlling
Yeah.
it. And that's such an
Absolutely.
issue, you know, like over the years, that's just been done again and again. So I kind of wanted to expand in a way the like borders of a historical novel and sort of shake the
Right.
history loose from its moorings and put the reader into it in a way that they couldn't just like say, oh, I'm reading this thing about the 18th century. So that was kind of my goal. And, you know, there's,
Mhm.
like you said, there's a whole layer of stuff that I don't even bring into the book. Some of that stuff, you know, Maud Casey looked at more with other patients at the Salpêtrière, other
Right.
doctors. But I was wanting to create like an emotional, pervasive emotional experience versus necessarily like a period piece or a biographical thing or an examination of trauma on that level. And I don't think any of those things are not valuable. It's just that for
Yeah.
me, that isn't kind of what calls me to a project or writing.
You don't want people to feel like, oh, there it is. History's all tied up, reified. We know this. You're presenting these kind of fragments, but at the same time, they have such an immediacy here. It almost at certain points reads like a really experimental thriller in a really good
Mm-hmm.
way, just where you're so caught up in the intrigue and the pacing is pretty spectacular.
Thank you, because I can't even tell you how hard that was to achieve. Well, it's just I had like essentially I think over 1,000 fragments that I was working on at one point with putting this book in order, and there was
Right.
so many drafts where it would hit this kind of stasis at a certain point, and it took so long to keep cutting it down and cutting it down until the actual movement made sense and worked. So it makes me very happy to hear that, because there were so many years I was like, oh my God, it's still not working.
Which is so worthy of respect and celebration that you stuck with it. And so I wanted to ask you about that. So you worked on this novel for about 20 years, and even at one point worked on it in Edna St. Vincent Millay's barn. I think you had a retreat, which sounds amazing. How do you think that writing it over that expanse of time affected the finished product?
It was such a hard issue for me. And like, there are parts of me that still get really angry at myself for having, like, there were long periods of avoidance throughout this whole process too. It wasn't like I was working on it every day for 20 years. There were times when I really let it drop away. And there are times when I felt like I wasn't even a writer anymore and caused all these like mental chaos. But then I think when it finally got finished and put out in the world, I do recognize that there's no way it would have been the same book if it hadn't gone through that. And one of the things that it really helped me with was coming up with more of a compassionate take on Charcot, because I was able to really understand the torment that he was going through about trying to create, this masterpiece that he thought was going to like change everything. But at the same time, he's approaching his elderly years. He's no idea if he's going to figure it out. It's looking less and less like he's going to. He's starting to think it's all going to turn on him, which eventually it did after his death. He went through a period of disrepute because of the hysteria work that he did. And so I feel like that opened up a lot for me, for him, and gave me a little bit more compassion. So it wasn't sort of a flattened look at this person. Like he was creating something, and it meant so much to him, and he was struggling and failing in certain ways, and then going way over the border into sort of not falsifying, but shaping everything very specifically towards what he was trying to say. And then it ultimately ended up sort of being what his nightmare was. So I don't think that could have existed. And I think the years of various traumas that went on and things like that in between, and living with the character of Augustine, who I really, felt a desire to portray in a, if not accurate, like emotionally true way to me, like that developed over time. And so I try to make peace with it now and realize it just is what had to be with this book. But it was definitely, it still sort of haunts me that so much time went into the one project.
But I think you succeeded with portraying Augustine in this very emotionally true way. And I definitely noted your compassion for Charcot. And I was really moved by that, because I think that would be really hard for me to portray him in a compassionate way. I think for most people, I had some really negative experiences with doctors as a child. And if I were going to write something about him and if I flattened him like that, something would have been lost. You managed to avoid that trap because of the many drafts you went through. Sometimes it takes that, for sure.
And I also just think it needed to be there to explain the relationship, that there are points at which they both connect in this kind of incredible, although enmeshed and dysfunctional way, as like these co-creators of this reality. And there's something very beautiful about that. And I think that you have to have some understanding of why there would be any kind of link between the two of them. Or, I do think that Augustine saw certain things more clearly about Charcot, at least my creation of Augustine. He saw things about Charcot more clearly than he could see about himself. And that was something I definitely wanted to kind of bring out and explore too.
That's another thing, another genre that the novel reminded me of. I feel like I've mostly seen it in film, but the story of the artist and his female muse, but they're actually more co-creators than he realizes. It has that aspect as well. Thank you so much for talking to me today, Nina.
I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was great. And again, this is Nina Shope, and her novel Asylum is amazing, and I put a link to it in the episode notes. I want to thank Nina Shope for speaking with me and sharing her work with us. Please come back on October 15th for the first part of an interview with psychotherapist Ellis Amder. Thank you for listening. Take good care.